and Adam, I'll begin with you because you were just in Minnesota. There are Americans who want more immigration enforcement, who don't necessarily, want ICE to be abolished, who are worried about immigration and border security and are worried about violent criminals. Those people are out there. Some of those people are the ones protesting in Minnesota because what they're seeing immigration enforcement do in the interior is not what they voted for. Explain what you saw, who you met.
Well, what I saw in Minnesota was a state full of people that was really devoted to protecting their neighbors. And these are people who are, of many different, they're people who probably have many different, views on immigration, but they don't want their neighbors kidnapped. They don't want their kids go to school with kidnapped. They're doing things like, following ICE around and recording them when they have encounters. They're making sure people are fed. They're making sure people can pay their rent. And they're doing this because Donald Trump has decided to use, federal agents as a partisan militia to inflict pain and suffering on the parts of the country that did not support him as much as he believed they should. This is not really about immigration enforcement. It's about intimidating people for having the wrong political views by sending masked armed federal agents into their cities to make their lives miserable. A lot of conservatives seem shocked that this is the reaction, but this is precisely what happens when you do that. This is precisely what happens when you send people into a city to intimidate those people and make them feel as though you can do anything to them without consequences. These men are wearing masks, and the government, as you just described, is completely willing to allow them to shoot people in the street, in the back, in the face, and then just completely decline to investigate or hold anybody accountable or even name the people involved. And I think, a lot of regular Trump voters who have conservative views on immigration do not want to see masked federal agents shooting Americans in the street because, they did something that those federal agents did not like.
Was there an assumption, Adam, that the people that were going to go out in Minnesota to protest ICE, that these were all, seasoned operatives, that they were all agitators, they were part of organized groups who were never going to support the administration no matter what, and that the American public would see that and they would side with immigration enforcement?
I think there was an expectation that that there would be a bunch of rabble-rousers who might respond with violence, and the administration would therefore have a popular mandate to crack down even further. Instead, what these people did was engage in a strategy of observation, avoidance of direct physical confrontation with federal agents. All these confrontations that we've seen have been initiated by them in terms of being physically confronted. The people who they confronted were filming them or were in the area. But they have focused on protection and observation rather than, engaging in any sort of act of violence. This is a nonviolent civic resistance. And I think that has been very frustrating for the Trump administration, which wanted sort of the spectacle of riots that they could use to crack down even further. And the way that that that's the case is that they keep insisting that there are violent riots everywhere, even though that's not what's happening. And there's there's literally no footage attesting to that allegation.
Yeah, I just think there's an interesting wrinkle here, and it was on display at the top of the show, David, and that was the last woman who said she doesn't really agree with the protests, but she's sick to her stomach over what she's seen ICE do. And that is interesting. It's interesting to have somebody, and I'm not sure if the Trump administration expected this, to have somebody who wants the immigration enforcement done, who doesn't believe in the protesters, doesn't believe they should be interfering or stopping, but also was able to look at the images that she's seeing and come to the conclusion herself that what immigration officers are doing is wrong, that it's worse than the protesters, that they are the ones that are crossing a line.
So here's what I don't think Trump has gotten as a result of his election. There are a lot of people on the Trump base and the MAGA base who are genuinely anti-immigrant. They really, really want fewer immigrants. But there's a lot more people who voted for Trump because they were anti-chaos. In other words, they saw the flood of people across the border. the flood of migrants into city streets, and they saw it as chaotic. They saw it as disordered, and they wanted order. And there's a version of Trump where he comes in and he gets the border under control and then does normal, humane deportation, immigration enforcement, the way previous presidents have, from Obama to Biden to Bush, and just follow the normal process. He would have the wind at his back right now. But instead, he substituted one form of chaos for another form of chaos, one that is increasingly deadly. And now that you're seeing unarmed people shot dead in the streets, and you're seeing the administration's stories about so many of these alleged attacks on Border Patrol or ICE blowing up in court, they're being exposed again and again as lying. The chaos calculation is shifting against him. So now the people who don't want chaos are looking at Trump and saying, you're the cause, you're the reason. Can't we just have sensible policies and normal order?
Yeah, and you had that one gentleman say, rightly, that President Obama deported a lot of folks, 3.1 million immigrants, migrants, and they'll say that the numbers they had in terms of violent criminals were, up around 90%. They did it. Not popular when he was doing it, but Americans weren't getting shot and killed in the street. And that is another part of this, and I think you rightly point this out. There are Americans who believe they are there just protesting, who do not understand or maybe hadn't fully anticipated, in the case of Renee Good or Alex Preddy, that the rules of engagement had changed. The ground rules had changed.
Totally. So they think they're operating in the normal world where, as we've seen, police aren't always restrained. We have had bad police incidents, many bad police incidents, but as a general matter, police respond to the public with restraint and professionalism and discipline. If you're out there in the public, you know that's the norm for police. And so if you're protesting now, you think you're living in that norm, you're not anymore. You're living in a world where these individuals, many of them are terribly trained. Many of them believe they're on some sort of ideological crusade, and they're not being held accountable in the slightest. They're being granted an enormous amount of discretion, an enormous amount of immunity, and all that is adding up to is authoritarian violence, which is chaotic.
John and Peter, I want to, or John and Peter, I want to get you on this because you're at the White House, you cover the White House, you speak to sources there. I wonder what really is behind the president's changing tune on this, why he called Governor Walz, why he called Mayor Frey, why he switched out Bovino for Tom Homan. Is it that Republicans were getting uncomfortable? Was it calls from Republican senators? Is it Greg Abbott saying they need to recalibrate? Is it that he doesn't want to see Americans killed? Or is it, as the Wall Street Journal reports, that Donald Trump thought the Minnesota operation looked chaotic and not strong, according to, they say, people familiar with the matter? Is there any one reason, overarching reason, John?
I think it's a combination of things, Katie. I mean, what President Trump did this past weekend, and it was a rare weekend for him in Washington. He wasn't in Palm Beach. He wasn't out golfing. What was he doing? He was inside. He was watching television, and he was seeing the nonstop footage of what happened in Minneapolis. He was getting updates on his phone as well, and worried calls from Republicans. And he, as we've reported, grew increasingly unhappy with how people for his administration were talking about this on television, that what they were saying, and that's Secretary Noem, it's certainly Bovino, what they saying simply wasn't supported by the facts, wasn't supported by the videos that he and the rest of the nation were seeing. So I do think the chaos was part of this. I think that he recognized that the politics of this was getting away from him. So no, we should not overstate that this is suddenly an about face on deportations, that suddenly these ICE operations and Border Patrol operations will cease. What I think is clear is that there's going to be a bit of a de-escalation in Minneapolis, at least for the time being. Bovino's out, Homan in. I think the president is tired of what he sees as the problem there in that particular city, hence the calls with Walz and the mayor of Minneapolis, who we should note, by the way, still remain under Department of Justice investigation. So it's not like everyone is all kumbaya here. This is still very much a political operation. The president's still looking at fraud in the Somali community, et cetera, alleged fraud, I should say. And there certainly could be, this operation could move to another city down the road. But I think there's an acknowledgement that, and Republicans unhappy about it, that they needed to take their foot off the gas at least a little bit when it comes to the Twin Cities.
Yeah, Peter, same question to you.
Yeah, I agree with all. Of course, I think he's watching not just maybe this network and maybe not one of the other networks that was showing some of these pictures, but even on the network he prefers, there were skeptical questions, skeptical anchors who were saying, "Wait a second, this guy didn't seem to be a threat. The video didn't seem to suggest that he was an assassin. Didn't seem to suggest he was a domestic terrorist." And so even on the right, he was hearing voices saying, hold on a second, this isn't matching what we're seeing. You see a lot of, Republicans starting to voice their concerns publicly, and some, I think, privately. Kevin Stitt, the governor of Oklahoma, Governor Welch of Vermont. Marjorie Taylor Greene was on the outs with the White House, but put it, I think, in a way that a lot of people on the MAGA side could understand. She said, what if this were reversed? What if this were the Biden government, the federal government, coming after J6ers who didn't, pose a threat? What would we be saying about that if that happened? And I think also the Second Amendment part of it was a factor on the right as well, because basically there are a couple of lines out of the federal government saying, hey, if you come to a protest with the gun, you are by definition suspect, and we assume potentially a criminal. That rankled people who spent their lives fighting for gun rights, for the notion that you can legally carry a gun in a public place, and that doesn't make you a criminal. So all of these things, I think, came together to make him think twice about how he wanted to keep going. And he has been sort of upset, as people have said, with Secretary Noem, and she's been the public face of this, and it didn't help her with with her president.